Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Sally Ann Sack, and today our guest is Dr. Jeffrey Malka. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Jeff is a local, retired now, orthopedic surgeon, but what we're going to talk about today is his avocation, which is Sephardic genealogy. Jeff has written a book called, actually he wrote it a few years ago, Sephardic Genealogy. The rest of it is Discovering Your Sephardic Ancestors and Their World. And since I'm your publisher, I should have remembered the title. That was in 2002. Since then, you've been enormously active. In fact, many people think of you as Mr. Sephardic Jewish Genealogy. And you have now put up a wonderful website with Sephardic Jewish genealogical resources. And that is sephardicgen.org? Or .com. Okay. That's what we're going to talk about today, is this website. But before we get started, I have to just tell you my Sephardic thing. My Sephardic thing is that back in 1997 at our annual conference, which was in Paris that year, and it was the first year we had a sizable Sephardic programming and contingent. And I gave a talk on the world of Jewish genealogy, and I said, for some reason, the Sephardic genealogy seems to have lagged behind the Ashkenazic. Now in 1997, it seems to be where the Ashkenazic was in about 1980. So I would ask you, if you would, to tell our viewers the difference between these two words, and then to tell us about this Sephardic genealogy story.
Well, there are many definitions as to what you might call Sephardic as opposed to Ashkenazi, but the easiest way to define it is Ashkenazi Jews are Jews who lived essentially in Europe in a Christian world, remnants of the Roman Empire.
Right.
The Sephardic Jews are the Jews who lived in the other empire, the Muslim world, which included Spain because Spain was under the Muslims for 800 years. But essentially, that is the big difference, and the difference is because since these two empires were at war, there was lesser communication between the two and some difference in both resources that are available, even in traditions. And that's the simplest way to define it.
Could I interrupt for a minute?
Sure.
You said the empire. We don't know it as a Muslim empire. We knew the Holy Roman Empire. What empire are you talking about?
Well, I'm really making it simple, the Muslim world.
Okay.
In fact, the Roman Empire hasn't existed for a long time.
Right.
But what we think of as Europe is really the son of the Roman Empire. And so what I'm saying is where the Muslims ruled, and that varied at different times. The Muslims, the Ottoman Empire, went as far as Vienna at one time.
Right.
So it has fluctuated in size, but it ended up being basically what you want to think of as Turkey, the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. That's really...
And Persia?
And Persia. The difference is that the Jews who lived in those countries, those parts of the world that weren't necessarily countries, tended to follow the Babylonian traditions and Geonim. Okay. That was their religious source. And therefore, they developed traditions that were based on that. Even the Jews in Spain that had, I don't want to get into the history of this, but the Jews in Spain under the Visigoths had been decimated. There were hardly any Jews left. And when the Muslims conquered in 711, what they basically did, Jews flooded Spain from North Africa mainly, and from places like Baghdad and that area. And they brought with them Judaism back into Spain. So is in fact, that's why sometimes it's kind of dumb to talk about Mizrahi and Sephardi. There had been so many movements back and forth. I don't want to get into the history part, but basically when we talk about the 1492 expulsion, well, that was just the very last expulsion.
Yes.
Maimonides left in the 12th century. So did my ancestors, by the way. So people came and left many times back and forth. And so it's a much more mixed thing. But what did, even people from the Ashkenazi world moved to Spain and vice versa. There was a major Sephardi community in Vienna, for crying out loud. But essentially there were differences because of they lived in worlds that were basically warring with each other. Even the Ottoman Empire was not exactly friendly to the Christian countries, which were really the subsets of part of what used to be the Roman Empire. So I'm using the terms loosely.
Okay,
The Muslim world and the Christian world may be a better way to say it.
Okay, and this database of yours, or this website with databases, what does the website include?
It's a little bit difficult to discuss it, but if we go to the page, I'll show you, because the website is really very large. I'm trying to make it provide as many resources as I can for the Sephardic genealogist, because his requirements are different. For example, if we look at the main page of the website, which is here, we have a column on the left and a column on the right, which gives you the various sections that I'm talking about. On the left, let me get back here. On the left, we have, for example, a section on Sephardic history. There's a section on Sephardic genealogy, section on websites by country, section on databases, which I'd like to talk more about because it's one that has expanded enormously recently. Sephardic surnames, Sephardic gazetteer, archives, bibliography, extensive bibliography, how to start, Sephardic family trees that are on the web, genealogy forms, Sephardic news lists, calendar conversions, because Jews who lived in the Muslim world need to convert not just from the Gregorian calendar, but also from the Muslim calendar and from various Muslim calendars. Things about Ladino and so on. And so let me just give you a sample, and then we'll go talk a little bit more about the databases. If I click on, say, Sephardic history, what do I see? Here's an example. This is a history of the Sephardic Jews of Spain. Who are they in their history? Jews and Christians in the Muslim world, which is what we were talking about. Maps and history, changing population figures. And also a second section here about historical articles from the web, Jews of ancient Rome, the Alhambra decree, and so forth. But let's give an example. We're still in the history section, which is just one section. Let me click on, say, the one about the history. Here's the history. And it goes on from the beginning on to early history, the Moors, etc.
You have done a huge job.
That is only one section. Let's get back to the main page, which was we discussed Sephardic history. If we go to Sephardic genealogy, how to get started for the beginner.
Oh, and you have that funny thing about Dan Leeson spoof.
That's right. I put that in there because I get a lot of emails asking me, my name is so-and-so, can you send me my family tree? As a matter of fact, I got such an email just last week.
I get them all the time.
And you know, you can't do that. And I talk about, this is more about genealogy, so I talk about Jewish names and genealogies, the origins and the meanings. If we can go back to the website, it'll be easier for me to show what I'm talking about. So if we can get back onto that website, it'll be good.
The main page?
This page right here. And whatever I have, you don't need to show me, you can just talk about the website. If we go back, that was about genealogy. I also have a section on websites by country. And here you can get general Sephardic sites, as you can see, Sephardic family pages, sites for the Caribbean, for the Anusim, for the Egypt, for France.
We have to stop and talk about what the word Anusim means.
Well, Anusim is just a Hebrew term. One of the things, frankly, I had never come across them in my own life until I got into genealogy, except knowing about them theoretically. But a lot of the Jews in Spain were forced to convert. And so some of them converted authentically into Catholicism, but some of them continued to be what we call crypto-Jews. In other words, hidden Jews, they continued to practice Judaism in secret. That's what the Inquisition was about. And so these crypto-Jews are all over the world, mostly in places like South America, also out in the American Southwest, and they're starting to come out. There are some in Portugal, etc. So they don't, the word crypto-Jew is one term. Anusim is a Hebrew word that simply means forced convert. And so they prefer that term. But I mean, one can go to everything. Say, for example, let me click on any one of these sites. Let me click on Sephardic sites, say, for Portugal. Just to give you an example what you'd find there. In each of these sites, it's the same thing. There's a section of things that are genealogy-oriented, like a whole bunch of archives where they're actual websites that you can go to those archives and what you can do there, and general sites which are really background sites.
I have a question for you. There is a large collection of books, I think it's 6 volumes, that was written by a man named Jose Maria Abecassis. Absolutely. And it's one genealogy after another. I own the set, but is it here on this?
It is most certainly. That would be in a different section, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. This is the problem I have with this website. It's so huge, it's hard to talk about everything. But what you're talking about is we're going to go and spend some time on the databases. What do we mean by databases? Well, the databases actually, no, to answer your question, I'm going to go back and look at Sephardic surnames.
Okay.
So I'm going to click on Sephardic surnames, just to give you an idea. I have some articles at the top where I discuss them, but to give you an example, here's a list of books that contain surname studies, onomastic books. There is the Abikassis books, Abraham Laredo's book, Joseph Toledano, etc., etc. And all of these are actual links. Here I have a description of what they are, where they were published, and if you click on any one of them, say the Abikassis book, which is about mostly Gibraltar and Portugal, I have the 4 volumes here, plus what are the family names which are discussed in that. Among them is, of course, you would expect it to be, here's the Malka surname right up in there.
I want to interrupt you to
Yes.
say, by the way, a large number of people in those books have branches in Brazil.
That is correct, because Sephardic Jews have moved in many directions, and we're going to get far afield there, but there are a lot of them in South America. There's an awful lot of crypto-Jews who know that they were Sephardic Jews at one time or another, but there are also actually, there are Sephardic Jews all over South America, although today most of the Jews living in South America are actually not Sephardic anymore. They're mainly Eskenazi. But anyway, let's get past the surnames, because I only mentioned that because you mentioned it. There is, for example, a Sephardic gazetteer, but I'm going to go to the databases.
Okay.
Here's a list of databases that are actually on the website. There's about 50 of them. And if we can see here, they go by, I've got them sorted.
This one, I wanted to
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
Sorted by countries, Algeria, Austria, Bulgaria. Each one of these, for example, take prominent Jews in Egypt, just to pick one out of the blue moon. Each one of these is not just a database, there's a little introduction about them, and then they are searchable. They have search engines, each one of them. So take a stake here, for example, we'll take an A as, consider something that starts with A, and we'll go and we'll search. And there's your answers.
Wow.
And this is the kind of information you would get: surname, given name, father's name, town of birth, country of birth, date of birth, etc. So, having said that, I'm going to get back to the major, now throughout the website, because it's very huge and you can get lost, I have a navigation system at the top of every single page. We are now at Egypt and UR 42243. It came from the page called Databases, which is all the databases. If I click on any of these, I can go back. I don't want to go back to the main page. I'm going to go back to the database page, because you asked me about what is this. One can go through all of these 50 databases and it takes a lot of time to search each one individually. So to make it easier, I took all the surnames, just the surnames, and put them in an index of these databases.
It's a consolidated Jewish surname index.
That's exactly what it is. It's consolidated index of Sephardic surnames.
And is that, by the way, included in that one I just mentioned?
No, it is not, because these are separate databases that are not in there.
Oh, we have to consider
this
that.
one so far contains 33,000 names, and it's going up by 1,000 almost every week as I keep adding, because I haven't finished. This is a work in progress. But it's because, so you can be sure what it does, I include here a list of what's included in this part, which databases are included. There's rabbinical databases, there's deportees database, there's surname lists, etc. And let's see what it really looks like. Let's go to it. This is the consolidated surname index. I have again a description which databases are included. I have some tips what to use. And then, because it is huge, you can search forever. It will be page by page. I can set it up by country.
Do you have it set by Soundex?
It's also set up by Soundex. As you can see, all these names say given name, contains, is exactly, sounds like, starts with, or ends with.
What Soundex do you use?
Because this is Sephardic, I thought, and I'm not sure that's the best choice, but the Mokotov one may not be the best one for it.
Right.
So I use the American Soundex system, which may or may not work, but it seems to work pretty well.
If the W is silent, like in snow,
Yeah.
then it works well. If the W in these names sounds like a V, then it doesn't work well. That's the main item that
It could be, but I figured since the Mokotov one was mainly aimed at Eastern European names, which are very different in their sounding things, right or wrong, that's what I selected.
Okay.
But say, if we choose a country, for example, just to give you an idea what happens, say Egypt, and we're just going to look at anything that comes up in Egypt, and we go on search. What you're going to see is here very simple, just the surname, the given name, the database where you'll find more information about it. And each one of these is a link. Say, for example, yes, Abastado or Abecassis.
No, why are these two separate? They seem to be the same.
They're different. This one is in the Annuaire, and this one is in Fargione.
Because they're two separate.
This is where you can find more information about these particular things. So, okay. So if we click on any of these, it'll take you to that database where you can find much more information, because this only tells you the name, the first name, and which database contains it.
I want to interrupt you again for a minute.
Sure.
How often does it happen, if at all, that a name that you've listed as a Sephardic surname, Sephardic Jewish surname, also is used by Ashkenazi Jews? Are they totally separate, or do they overlap somewhat?
Well, there are Ashkenazi Jews, there's Sephardic Jews who moved into Ashkenazi lands.
Right.
And take, for example, one of the most prominent Sephardic names, Abrabanel. There are Abrabanels who live in Ashkenazi land, so you would find them. But they're relatively rare. Most of the Sephardic Jews who retain their Sephardic surnames also retain their Sephardic identities. Take the Pereira family that lived for hundreds of years in Vienna and in Europe. But they remain, and they always call themselves as being Sephardic.
I'm trying to remember, there's a famous painter, Pizarro.
Pizarro, well, he certainly didn't call himself Ashkenazi.
Right.
And they tended to, first of all, their names would remind them, but their names therefore are different. Are there some that occurred in Ashkenazi lands? Of course, because some moved there and sometimes forgot their identity.
Yes.
And there are lots of Ashkenazi Jews, particularly who escaped pogroms and went to Sephardic lands. There were at least 5,000 Ashkenazi Jews in Egypt who moved there at the end of the 19th century. There were thousands of Ashkenazi Jews who moved into Turkey to avoid various Turkeys.
Okay, so then if you've got books on the names of Jews of Egypt,
yes,
and if it's written at the beginning of the 20th century, you're going to have some Ashkenazi names in there.
It depends on the database. The one about the prominent Jews, I didn't want to separate them apart, so everybody in there. It so happens that of the prominent Jews in Egypt, probably 95% were Sephardic.
Okay.
It just turned out that way.
Right.
But if there were Ashkenazi names, I did not eliminate them. But most of these databases are databases like in Constantine, in Algeria, and whatever, and they would not tend to have Ashkenazi surnames.
What about Turkey?
I did not happen to include in the databases in Turkey, I don't happen to have the Turkish names from the Ashkenazi synagogue. I just didn't have that database.
There is, you know, the book of the Jewish names of Turkey?
I did not use that one. For example, for Turkey, if we go down to Turkey, we will look. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. We will go and look in Turkey. The big book that is used is the Galante book.
Yes.
It has 4 volumes. Well, that one is indexed. It's 9 volumes, of which 4 are about names, and that one's indexed, but everybody in there is really Sephardic.
Okay, I have that Turkish book with the
yes,
recent one.
I know the one you mean.
Is there a reason you wouldn't want to include it?
Yeah, it may be copyright issues, basically.
Oh.
See, every database in here, we've gotten permission from the author to actually index them. If some books, I don't have any way of getting their copyright. That particular book from Turkey is basically itself an index.
Yes, it is.
It is just a name. And I have not contacted the author, and
if you'd like, I could help you with that.
We could try that, sure.
Okay.
Sure. The purpose of this website is anyway just to make it as easy as possible for the Sephardic genealogist to find resources that he might not be aware of. I know that when I started, I was told you cannot do Sephardic genealogy.
Yes.
And for several years I said, okay, forget it. And then as I discovered that that's not true, that you can actually, there are databases. Yes, there are weaknesses, but there are also tremendous strengths in other areas. And yes, you can do Sephardic genealogy, and in fact, you can go much further back.
Exactly.
So anyway, so for me, I didn't want other people to go through that same frustration. And the purpose of this is just to make it available, to educate them. And it's done in a self-interested fashion. If I can get more Sephardic Jews interested in doing their own research, I will learn things from them, which will help me too. In fact, now the accent is not so much on putting what is known on the website. I'm trying very hard to uncover new sites, and I'm in the process of doing that. New resources,
and
not
how
sites.
do you do that?
Well, you just question and ask around. There's a place, for example, there's a museum I found out in Casablanca where a lot of Jewish communities in Morocco that no longer exist deposited their records there. And that museum has them there in its archives. It's done absolutely nothing with them.
Do you know if the government would allow you to approach it?
That's the touchy issue. It's not so much the government, it's the person who runs the museum, who's a Jewish person, whose name is Levy, is very scared of doing anything. But nonetheless, I haven't finished, and that has a lot of resources about communities all over who no longer exist in Morocco, but whose records still exist. Some of these are, of course, in Israel, but some are not.
And of course, there's the whole thing about the Jews of Egypt and their records, which
the Jews of Egypt is
those records are huge.
They're huge and they're very advanced, and some of them are out already, by the way, at Yeshiva University Archives.
Oh, yeah, but only a little.
They're only a little, and they're mostly out of Cairo, if I remember right. Not Alexandria, but. There are things in the works to try and get some of these out.
You said that you've done this primarily to help people, but now you're focusing on new resources. If you had a wish list, what would you wish somebody would do or you could do that you alone can't do? If resources were available, how could we develop this field further in a major way?
There are so many areas to go. One is cemeteries that are not being photographed or identified so that you can get all the names out of the tombstones. They're all over North Africa and ignored.
Would the governments allow people in?
Yes, they can, or you got to go there with a camera. And in fact, some people have already done that for this or that cemetery, but there are many, many more. That's one thing. I push on that because it's a perishable resource.
Yes.
These cemeteries go bad, the stones go bad, become illegible. But there are other resources that can wait, but that are the ones where you have the biggest bang for the buck.
Yes.
Is the notarial records. Notarial records of Spain. They they are in the various archives of the various kingdoms of Spain, because Spain was many kingdoms. So they are notarial in the archives of Aragon, the archives of Catalonia, the archives of Valencia.
No, we Americans hardly even know what a notary is. So why don't you start with what these? Who was a notary in Spain?
Every time you sold a house, every time you bought a house, every time you made a loan, every time you paid interest, a notary had to write this down. And in Spain, they did that from the 12th century. And as a result, since the 12th century, there are literally thousands per year per small town. So this is an enormous resource. And in these archives, of which I have researched, found my own... Personally, I found my own family names in there. In these archives, Jews were always identified. First of all, they're easily identifiable just by their names. They had biblical names, and it was obvious they were Jewish. But they were also identified because at the end of the name was always put Judeo.
Really?
Jew. So you clearly knew who was a Jew. As a matter of fact, certain academicians have studied 100 years here, 100 years in Toledo, and written books where they have extracted just records that contain Jews.
Is that on the website?
That is on the website. Or there is on
the
website.
Chaim Beinart, or?
No, the Leontello. Leontello is a lady archivist at the archives of Toledo who wrote a 2-volume book called Judeos de Toledo. And what this is basically an extraction of all the records for a period of about 100 years where they mention Jews. And you can see through there people buying this thing. They had title searches on the 12th century. It is absolutely amazing. So this resource is enormous and goes back to the 12th century. I found evidence of my Malka family living within the same 2-3 towns in Aragon for 250 years straight until the date of the expulsion.
From what year?
From a little after 1200 to 1491 was the last record I could find of them.
Do you know where your Malkas, what they did in 1492?
They were one of them was a, what do you call it, a smith. One of them was nothing dramatic.
No, I mean, did they
fancy.
leave Spain?
So, well, it's a big family, so some left then, some left earlier. A couple converted. I found one that converted.
That's just...
So this is an enormous resource, and of course it's hard to link up directly to them, but on the other hand, since there were only so many Jews in the world in those days, and if they have your own name, what are the odds that they're not your direct ancestor on the paternal side?
Absolutely. So. Now, we have just about a minute left.
Yes.
And you were right, this is a huge research. In the 1 minute left, what is it that you'd like to be sure to say that we haven't gotten to?
Well, the best thing to do is to simply go to the site and explore. There's a huge bibliography site. There are books on every, separated by country, by type, where pretty much anything you would need to know would be there. It's not just the bibliography. There are all kinds of tools, and there's a lot of information about how Sephardic genealogy is similar and how it is different than the rest of Jewish genealogy.
I have a question. For those who know that they have Sephardic roots...
You all do.
Okay, I'd be happy.
Where do you think Ashkenazi Jews came from?
Yes, there's some great stories, and I'm going to finish with one of my favorite. My maiden name is Amdur. Okay. When my father's youngest brother was drafted into the army in World War II, you know, they call out the names. He's in Texas, and the sergeant says, Amdur! And my uncle steps forward. Later, a very tall, swarthy guy came up to my uncle and said, "You Amdur? We're the only 2 Turks on this base." And since that man worked in the kitchen, my uncle did not disabuse him. And he talked about how they would get steaks and go over the border into Juarez on weekends.
Well, when I first met you and I knew about Amdur, this was many years ago, I also thought it must be a Sephardic name.
It's the name of a town in Russia.
I know.
But do Sephardic Jews have an organization, a genealogical belongingness that is separate?
Not really. My purpose in writing this website is not to make it separate, but in fact I donated a lot of these files to Jewish Gen precisely because I don't want it to be separate. But it's just different enough that you need to know they don't have a separate thing. There is Etsy, which is a periodical in Paris for Sephardic genealogy, but there really isn't a direct society.
Well, we ran out of time while we were talking, so thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
And we'll have to revisit this in a while. I'm sure you'll have something twice as big.
Thank you.